Imagine a late September afternoon in a small English village, sometime in the 18th century. The fields of wheat have nearly been stripped bare. Only a patch of standing corn remains, swaying gently in the breeze. The sun is dipping low and warm behind it. The reapers gather around this final sheaf, their sickles glinting, but no one moves at first. Cutting these last stalks is no ordinary task. It is charged with meaning. An older farmer clears his throat. "Well then, who'll take the old woman today?" he asks, and laughter ripples through the group. They all know what it means. The person who cuts the last sheaf gets the old woman, carrying the weight of winter until spring returns. Some step back, feigning reluctance, others nudge each other forward, until finally, a young man steps into the ring, grinning nervously. With a swift swing, he severs the stalk, and the women gather them up with careful hands. From this last bundle, a figure begins to take shape. The women braid and weave the stalks, plaiting them into loops and twists, until the sheaf resembles a doll, a corn dolly, or as they call it here, the corn mother. She is decorated with ribbons, perhaps a sprig of flowers. Her body slender but unmistakably feminine. When the work is done, the doll is lifted high and everyone cheers, hats tossed into the air. The corn mother is then given to the harvest queen, a young woman chosen for her vitality, who carries the figure back to the village atop the last cart of grain. Behind her, the farmers sing harvest songs, fiddles strike up, and the cart rolls slowly home. The corn mother, now enthroned, becomes the spirit of the fields themselves, life captured, preserved, and celebrated. That evening, the dolly is placed in pride of place at the harvest supper, presiding over a feast of bread, meat, and ale. All through the winter she will be kept safe, a silent guardian of the home, and a promise of renewal. When spring ploughing begins, she will be returned to the soil, sometimes buried in the first furrow, sometimes burned and her ashes scattered across the fields, so that the spirit of the harvest may be reborn. Hello and welcome to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore from all over the world and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. If you are new to the podcast, welcome on in. I really hope you love it here, and if you do, please do follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform, and you can also leave me a little comment if your platform allows and a review, as it really does help the show to reach new listeners, and I love to see this little community growing. Speaking of community, you can join the Discord server and or the Patreon, and all of the links are below in the show notes. If you join up, you'll get some access to some extra bits and pieces, including things like quizzes, fact sheets about words and artifacts, and much, much, much more. I won't bore you with all of the details. If you want to check that out, it's right there in the show notes. Anyway, enough about that. It's been a while, hasn't it? It has been a while. I took a little bit of time off because it was my birthday and I just wanted a little R&R time, a little bit of downtime, a little bit of time when my brain did not need to be engaged. And now I'm back and I'm here and I'm very excited because I feel like we've got a good episode today. I feel like this is going to be a really fun one. I thought, as we are on the brink of the change of the seasons, why not talk about the mythological women who represent this time of year? Both around the world and throughout history, cycles of planting, growth and harvest have not been only practical necessities, but also deeply sacred acts. And central to all of these cycles are women. Women in the fields, women in ritual and women in myth. All the way from Greek temples to Aztec pyramids, from the Baltic forests to the Andean highlands, feminine figures appear again and again and again as guardians of fertility, grain, and the balance between life and death. So today we're going on a bit of a worldwide exploration, if you will, across various different cultures to meet some of these remarkable women whose stories embody our relationship with the harvest. And we're starting in Greece. Few myths capture the interdependence of agriculture, seasonality, and the feminine quite as powerfully as the Greek story of Demeter and her daughter, Persephone. At its heart lies a tale of loss, of renewal, and the cyclical rhythm of the natural world, one that became central not only to Greek religion, but also to Mediterranean understandings of fertility and the harvest. Demeter, in the Greek pantheon, was the goddess of grain, agriculture, and the fruitful earth. She was revered above all as the bringer of sustenance, the one who transformed barren land into cultivated field. Demeter is the provider of staff for life, the first to teach humankind the art of tilling the soil, sowing seed, and reaping the harvest. That's a quote from Walter Burkert in his book Greek Religion. So without Demeter, crops wither and famine follows. And the story most intimately tied to the harvest is that of her daughter Persephone. According to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is one of the oldest surviving sources of around 7th century BCE, Persephone was gathering flowers in a meadow when Hades, the god of the underworld, seized her and carried her away to be his queen. Demeter's grief was overwhelming. She searched the earth in vain, and in her despair, she withdrew her blessings from the land. And then the crops failed. The fields lay barren, and humankind faced starvation. And this tale reaches its resolution only when Zeus, compelled by the cries of humanity, finally intervenes. And Persephone is allowed to return home to her mother. But because she has eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld, she can't go home permanently. And she must spend part of the year below in the underworld and part above. Therefore, each spring, Persephone rises and the earth blooms. Each autumn, she descends and the land falls barren. And the Homeric hymn says, "Then, when the earth flourishes with leaf and blossom, you will come up again from the misty gloom, a great marvel for gods and mortal men alike." So the myth, therefore, provides a pretty profound allegory for agricultural cycles. Persephone's descent is the harvest, it's cutting down of crops, it's the death of the fields, and her return is the sowing and sprouting of new life. Demeter's sorrow mirrors the fallow months of winter, her joy, the abundance of spring. And I was reading about the Homeric hymn and I found a really interesting commentary by Helene Foley. And I just want to tell you guys a quote from that, which I thought pretty much encapsulates what I've just told you. And it says, "The myth encodes the rhythm of agriculture as the rhythm of maternal grief and reunion, grounding a seasonal change in the female experience of loss and renewal." And that's exactly what it is. It's multi-layered. There's lots going on here. So not only have we got the cycle of the harvest, we've also got this really deeply entrenched theme of loss and grief and new life. So as you can imagine, this myth was pretty explanatory. It had a very explanatory function. So for people in ancient Greece, this was a way to explain the cycles of agriculture. But beyond that explanatory function, the myth also had a really large ritual significance. The Eleusinian Mysteries, which is one of the most important religious rites of the Greek world, centred on this very story of Demeter and Persephone. And this is celebrated annually at Eleusis near Athens, and the Mysteries initiated participants into sacred knowledge, promising blessings both in this life and the next. Central to these rites was the grain of wheat, the symbol of both mortality and regeneration. And there's lots of scholarly works about this that argue that the mysteries linked agricultural fertility with human destiny. Just as grain must be buried in the earth to be reborn, so too might human souls find renewal beyond death. And there's a whole book about this called Myth and Cult: The Iconography of the Eleusinian Mysteries, which I would really recommend that you read if you can. I did have a little read through, a little skim through while doing the research for this episode, but it is definitely something that I will go back to and read a little bit more. So I will put that in the show notes so you can have a little read too. Demeter's role as a mother is inseparable from her role as a harvest goddess. She embodies the sustaining power of the earth, but also its vulnerability to loss. Persephone, as maiden and queen, unites these themes together, these themes of fertility and mortality. She embodies both of them. She is both the seed buried in the soil and the new life that emerges from it. And together, they represent the archetype of agricultural religion, the goddess who suffers and rejoices with the seed, dying and rising with it. And while I wish I could tell you that I wrote that, I didn't write that. That was actually written by Walter Burkert in Greek religion. But it was too good not to include it, and I will not take credit for someone else's words. But the myth of Demeter and Persephone stands as a really powerful articulation of the human relationship with the harvest. It's not only about crops and survival, but it's also about the cycles of life and death, loss and reunion, grief and joy. And in their story, the ancient Greeks saw not only the fate of their fields, but also the fate of their souls. Now, what I'd like to do is go over to ancient Rome and have a little look at the Roman counterpart to Demeter. In the Roman world, the goddess Ceres occupied a role that was both recognisably parallel to Demeter, her Greek counterpart, and distinctly Roman in scope and emphasis. As the goddess of grain, agriculture and fertility, Ceres was central to Rome's religious imagination, but her worship also extended into law and order and the civic community herself. In her, the Romans recognised not only the sustainer of the harvest, but also the foundation of social life. And the name Ceres derives from the Indo-European root ker, meaning to grow or to nourish. And that's a really cool sort of echo of her function as the bringer of sustenance. And she was the provider of wheat and bread, which were the staples of the Roman diet, and was intimately linked to survival. In fact, Ovid, in his Fasti, went so far as to praise her as the source of civilization herself, and he wrote, "Ceres first turned the earth with the crooked plough. She gave us corn and made the fields a fruitful place. She gave us laws. All that is useful comes from her." And this is a really perfect example of the Roman emphasis. Ceres to them was not only an agricultural deity, but she was also the legislator. She was the one who brought both food and the order of society. To cultivate grain in Roman thought was to move from savagery to civilization. The most important cult of Ceres in Rome was established in 493 BCE on the Aventine Hill during a period of famine. Alongside her, there were two other deities of abundance and fertility who were worshipped, and they were Liber and Libera. And this Aventine triad was particularly associated with the plebeians, the common people of Rome, who depended most directly on grain for their livelihood. And Ceres became a bit of a patron of the plebs. She was a guarantor of their rights and their sustenance and their collective identity. And the Romans had a festival called Cerealia, which was celebrated in April. And this involved public games, offerings of spelt wheat, and, according to Ovid, a spectacular ritual in which foxes with flaming torches tied to their tails were released in the Circus Maximus. Now, I don't think we would be allowed to do that today. I can't understand how a fox's tail is strong enough to hold up a flaming torch. Mind you, I haven't had much experience with foxtails in my life, but I don't know. Do we think that would hold it up? I don't know. I'm thinking about my dogs and their tails, and I don't know. I'm not an expert. All I know is that I don't think we should be strapping flames to animals. So I don't think we should do that. You know, maybe we could get one of those little like LED light up collars or something like that. Anyway, back to the point. Scholars have debated this practice, and some interpret it as symbolic of purging fields of pests. Others see it as a ritual of purification and renewal. But whatever its meaning was, this festival emphasised both agricultural fertility and the communal joy of harvest abundance. Unlike the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, which emphasised secrecy and the individual's relationship to the cycle of life and death, Roman cults of Ceres were civic, public, and collective. They bound the community together around the shared dependence on grain. So, as Rome expanded and grain supply became more of a political issue, Ceres' role was invoked in debates about Annona, which was the grain dole distributed to the urban poor. So in this way, Ceres sort of acted as a bridge between the worlds of agriculture and politics. Ceres was also closely associated with women. Her rites often involved the participation of Roman matrons, and she presided over marriage, fertility, and childbirth. In some accounts, she was invoked in funeral rites as well, reinforcing her association with the cycles of life and death. The agricultural and the human were never far apart. The seed sown, the child born, the harvest gathered, and the dead buried all fell under Ceres' domain. So it's kind of tempting to think of Ceres just as the Roman version of Demeter, but the two goddesses reveal subtle but pretty important differences that reflect the cultures that worship them. Both were guardians of grain and personifications of agricultural fertility. Both were revered as motherly figures, sustaining life through the bounty of harvest. And both were invoked at times of famine, when the survival of the community hung in the balance. But Demeter's myth centres on her grief for Persephone and the cosmic explanation of seasonal cycles. But Ceres' worship took a much more civic and political turn. The Greek focus is mythological and psychological. The Eleusinian mysteries offered initiates profound insight into life, death, and rebirth, all through this metaphor of the seed. But the Roman focus is a lot more practical, it's a lot more communal. Ceres presided over the distribution of grain and the rights of the plebeians, as well as the stability of the state. And there's a quote from the Roman goddess Ceres, which was written by Barbet Spaeth in 1996. And she sort of summed this all up in one lovely sentence. And she said that Demeter's power lay in her maternal anguish, while Ceres' power lay in her role as the sustainer of Rome's people and laws. So there you go. Where Demeter tells a story of cosmic renewal, Ceres embodies the Roman conviction that agriculture is the foundation not only of life, but of civilization itself. Ceres was more than a goddess of crops. She was the emblem of sustenance, law, and community life. Where Demeter's mythology emphasizes maternal grief and renewal, Ceres embodies Rome's pragmatic union of agriculture and civic order. She represents not just the fertility of the fields, but the very structures, legal, social, and political, that turned grain into bread, and bread into civilization. And we're going to go out of Europe now. We are going to the cosmology of the Aztecs, where few deities were as essential to human survival as Xicomécoatl, and she was the goddess of maize, sustenance, and fertility. Her name, meaning seven serpent, reflected both abundance and the dangerous potency of the crop that sustained life. So if Demeter and Ceres embodied the grain fields of the old world, Xicomécoatl was the living spirit of maize, the plant upon which the peoples of Mesoamerica depended utterly for their existence. Xicomécoatl was often depicted as a young woman, richly adorned, holding ears of maize in her hands or carrying them in a vessel. In the Florentine Codex compiled by Franciscan Bernardino de Sagahan in the 16th century, she is described as the sustenance of mankind, their life, their support. So this characterization reveals her role not only as a goddess of agricultural fertility, but also as the embodiment of nourishment itself. Her worship was inseparably tied to the agricultural cycle of maize. In April, during the festival of Ue Tozostli, offerings of young maize plants were made to Chicomecoatl and other fertility deities to ensure the crop's growth. Later in the year, other festivals honoured her with sweeping rituals, dances, and sacrifices meant to purify the land at harvest time. These ceremonies reveal the Aztec understanding of the delicate balance between human effort, divine favour, and agricultural success. And one of the most striking aspects of Chicomecoatl's cult was its connection to sacrifice. In certain rituals, a young girl, richly dressed as the goddess, would be sacrificed. Her blood was offered to fertilise the earth, and it was recorded by Sahagun that they slew her, they offered her blood, that the maize might not perish, that it might not wither. So to the modern mind, this probably feels a little bit brutal. Yet within Aztec cosmology, it was seen as an essential. The earth gives life through maize, and humans must return life to the earth. And Chicomecoatl also functioned as part of a divine pair. She was often invoked alongside Centeotl, who was the male maize god, and they together formed a bit of a dual principle of agricultural fertility. But in many accounts, Chicomecoatl seems to be the much more fundamental figure, because she represented not only the maize itself, but also its sustaining power. And there's a historian called Miguel Leon Portilla, and he wrote a really cool book called Aztec Thought and Culture, all the way back in 1963, and he argues that Chicomecoatl embodies the centrality of maize in the Mesoamerican vision of the cosmos, where the human being is literally the maize person. And her imagery also carried quite a lot of protective associations, so farmers offered her maize ears wrapped in cloth, treating them as kind of sacred bundles to safeguard the seed for the next planting. So again, she's not only the goddess of harvest abundance, but also of continuity. She was the assurance that life would begin again with the next sowing. So in Chicomecoatl, we see a harvest goddess who was both gentle and fearsome, nourishing and demanding. She fed humanity, but she also required offerings in return. And her myths and her rituals reflect the precariousness of life in central Mexico, where abundance and famine were always close neighbours. And just as Persephone's descent explained the barrenness of winter in Greece, Chicomecoatl's rites acknowledged that the gift of maize was bound up with sacrifice and reverence. And I'm going to take you out of Mexico now, and we're going to the Baltics. And in the traditional beliefs of the Baltic people, particularly among Lithuanians, the figure of Zemyna stands as the very embodiment of the earth's generative power. Her name derives from Zeme, meaning earth in Lithuanian, and she was honoured as the goddess of fertility, soil, and the cyclical vitality of crops. Like Demeter or Ceres, Zemyna personified the inseparable link between the human community and the land that nourished it. Zemyna was regarded not only as a goddess, but as the living earth itself. To step on the ground without reverence, to sit upon it, or to desecrate it in any way, was to insult her. And once again, we see here a goddess of both harvest and of human life. For the same soil that gave grain also received the dead. And Zemyna also had ritual offerings. They were simple, but they were deeply symbolic. Farmers would pour things like milk, beer, or mead into the ground before planting, or they'd place bread directly in the soil as a gift. And these sort of offerings acknowledged her as the source of sustenance and fertility. And during harvest festivals, libations were made to thank her for the year's abundance. And in some accounts, women played a very special role in these rites, and that emphasised the connection between feminine fertility and the fruitfulness of the fields. Zemyna was sometimes imagined as the mother of all living beings, but she was not a benign maternal figure alone. Much like the soil, she could be nurturing or harsh, life-giving or barren. We're seeing that duality yet again. All these ladies of law are ringing that duality bingo bell. And if you did offend Zemyna, she would definitely withhold her blessings. She would turn that soil barren. She would incite crop failure. And this sort of dual role as a nurturer and a punisher puts her in close company with figures like Demeter, whose grief literally halted the growth of crops, or Chicomecoatl, whose abundance was balanced by sacrifice. Unlike the Olympian gods of Greece or the state cults of Rome, Zemyna's worship was really rooted in local everyday practices. There weren't any really grand temples to her. The soil itself was her shrine. And it's quite an intimate thing, really, and it reflects the Baltic people's worldview, which was that divinity was immanent in the natural world. Zemyna didn't need any temples or shrines because her very body was the ground from which sustenance came. So in Zemyna we find a pretty striking parallel to the Corn Mother traditions of England, which I'll go on to speak about in a bit, and the broader European notion of this sort of grain spirit, because all of them share the belief that the essence of life dwells in the soil and the harvest, and that women, whether they be in myth or in ritual, are kind of the custodians of this. And Zemyna's importance endured well into the Christian period, and she often blended at times with the Virgin Mary in folk devotion, and that just shows how deeply the image of this Earth Mother idea was embedded in Baltic cultural memory. And she remains, in essence, the cycle itself. Again, she's the earth that received the seed, brings it to life, feeds humanity, and finally reclaims both grain and people into her depths. And isn't it fascinating to think that we've spoken about quite a few women of the harvest at this point, and they all are so strikingly similar in what they represent and what they mean to the people that worship them. So shall we do another one? In the highlands of the Andes, life depends on the delicate balance between harsh mountains, shifting skies, and fertile valleys. And it's here where the figure of Pachamama has long reigned as the central deity of sustenance and fertility. Her name means World Mother, Pacha signifying both earth and time and space, and Mama meaning mother. And this term reveals her as an encompassing presence. She's not the soil, she's not a goddess of agriculture, she is the very cosmos as experienced by agrarian Andean communities. Pachamama embodies both the fertility of the earth and the cycles of planting and harvest. For the people of the Andes, maize and potatoes and quinoa were not just food, they were sacred life gifts, granted through Pachamama's benevolence. And once again, we're seeing a figure here who is far more than just a harvest goddess. She is the soil, she is the earth, she is the rain that fertilizes the soil. She is the seed, she is the crop, she is everything. And people worshipped her in that way. And ritual offerings to Pachamama were, and still remain, acts of reciprocity. Farmers would bury things like coca leaves or maize or chicha beer or even llama fat sometimes in the soil as a gesture of gratitude before sowing or harvesting. We heard things exactly like this in other mythologies. And this was part of the principle of Aini, or sacred reciprocity. I wish I could tell you how many times I have tried to say the word reciprocity in recording this. You would probably get a good hour of me trying to say that word, but I just said it twice. So that's an achievement for me today. But this principle demanded that humans give back to the Earth Mother who gave them everything. And failure to honour Pachamama properly was believed to bring poor harvests, illness, or natural disasters. And one of the most important ritual times for Pachamama was August, which was the start of the new agricultural year in the Andean calendar. And during this month, the earth was considered to be hungry and needed to be fed with offerings before it could yield abundance. So communities would gather to perform pagos a la tierra, or payments to the earth, and these were really elaborate ceremonies, and they involved things like incense and food, and drink and fun, and these rituals still persist today, and they're often syncretized with Catholic traditions. So that just goes to show Pachamama had such an enduring power in Andean spirituality. And unlike Demeter's grief or Chicomecoatl's demand for a blood sacrifice, Pachamama's mythology places a lot more emphasis on balance and harmony. She is nurturing and exacting, and if you treat her with respect, she's going to provide abundance. But if you neglect her or offend her, she'll unleash things like earthquakes, droughts, or landslides. So, it's probably best that you're good to her and you give her some llama fat. But in this sense, she is quite representative of the precariousness, again, of life in the Andes this time, where survival hinges on maintaining that right relationship with the environment, much like what we heard from the Aztec people. Spanish chroniclers of the 16th century quite often misunderstood Pachamama, or sought to actually suppress the cult of Pachamama, viewing it as a pagan idolatry, which is pretty standard for colonisers. Yet the devotion to Pachamama did persist, and it was often reinterpreted under the figure again of the Virgin Mary. And today she remains an active force in Andean identity and ecology, and she's invoked in indigenous rights movements and environmental ethics. In fact, Bolivia and Ecuador have actually formally recognised Pachamama in their constitutions as a legal subject with rights, which is a very striking modern testament to her continuing vitality as Earth Mother in the Andes. So again, Pachamama embodies so much more than agricultural fertility. Again, we see a figure who is the land itself. She is time itself. She is the cycle of sowing and reaping of life and death. And she is quite revealing of an Andean vision in which humanity is not master of the earth, but a child of it, bound in this sort of perpetual cycle of reciprocity. Oh, guys, that word has really got to me today. But yes, bound in perpetual reciprocity to the mother who both nourishes and sustains all. And finally, we're going to England, to the land of my home, to talk about the Corn Mother and the Corn Dolly. And among the harvest customs of England, there aren't many as evocative or steeped in feminine symbolism as the traditions surrounding the Corn Mother and the Corn Dolly. These are figures crafted from the final sheaf of grain, and they represent not only the material end of the harvest, but also the spiritual embodiment of fertility, continuity, and life of the fields. And at the heart of this tradition was the belief that the spirit of the corn lived in the crop itself. So when the fields were cut down, that spirit was driven into the very last standing sheaf. So to cut it was both a practical act, but also a ritual one. And that was the moment when the living force of the harvest was captured. And once that final sheaf was cut, that living force needed a new home. And this new home was the Corn Dolly, which was a figure plaited from stalks of wheat, barley, oats, or rye, crafted in very elaborate forms ranging from simple braids to very intricate woven effigies resembling a woman. And in some regions, this effigy was very explicitly called the Corn Mother or the Harvest Bride. And this Corn Dolly, or mother or bride, would be kept through the winter, often hanging in a farmhouse or placed in a position of honour until spring came again. And at that point, it would be returned to the soil. Sometimes it was ploughed into the first furrow, sometimes it was burned and the ashes were spread across the fields. And this ensured that the spirit of the harvest was not lost, but recycled, ready to renew the fertility of the land. And one of the most interesting things about the corn dolly tradition is it did carry a lot of social and communal dimensions. And in parts of England, the last sheaf was cut with a playful ceremony, and sometimes it was said that whoever cut that got the old woman. And that was seen as quite humorous, but it's also quite ominous because it meant bearing responsibility for the burdens of winter. In other areas, a harvest queen or a bride was chosen from among the women of the community. She was adorned with that last sheaf and she carried it in a procession. So in some places, these figures did blur the line a little bit between symbolic effigies and actual living participants, because the spirit of the grain could be embodied in a doll or in the body of a woman who, for that brief moment, took on that role of the corn mother herself. And I touched on this earlier, but just to come back to it, while the corn mother and the corn dolly traditions were widespread across the English countryside, the form and the symbolism and even the names of these harvest effigies varied significantly from region to region. And that was sort of reflective of the local crops that dominated particular landscapes and the richness of rural folklore in pre-industrial England. So what I thought it might be fun to do is just tell you a few different regional takes on the corn mother and the corn dolly traditions. And I'm going to start with East Anglia, which is Norfolk and Suffolk. If you've listened to my Suffolk folklore episode, then you'll know that I am a Suffolk girly myself. So I figured we'd start where I am right now. And East Anglia has very vast expanses of wheat fields. You can see them anywhere. I see them quite a lot when I am driving around where I live. And Suffolk became especially famous for very elaborate corn dolly designs and the plaiting and weaving of straw into really quite complex patterns developed into a bit of a distinct local craft by the time we got to the 19th century. Forms like the Norfolk lantern, the Cambridge umbrella, and the Suffolk horseshoe demonstrate both artistry and symbolic layering. And what I'll do is I'll put some links in the show notes so you can have a look at what these look like, because they are so intricate. They are so detailed. It's very, very interesting to look at. And these corn dollies were typically kept in farmhouses over the winter and ceremonially returned to the fields at the spring sowing. And they were so important to the people of East Anglia. They were essentially containers for the spirit of the fields, and they were relied on to ensure a good harvest. And if we go down the road a little bit to the West Country, which is Cornwall, Devon and the Somerset areas, the final sheaf of corn there was often shaped into a human figure and was frequently described as the harvest maiden or the corn maiden. In some villages, she was dressed with ribbons and flowers, and she was paraded through the village on the last cart of grain, accompanied by music and revelry. So here we have a bit more of a feminine imagery that was emphasised, and the maiden represented the fertility of the crops and also the vigour and promise of youth. And while in Suffolk the corn dollies were often placed in farmhouses, in this area the harvest maiden was often treated as a bit more of a living guest of honour and often stayed in somebody's house until returning to the fields. And to take us right up north into northern England and the Scottish borders, the last sheaf was often linked to the figure of the old woman or the cailleach. So whoever cut that last sheaf was said to have the old woman or to be burdened with her presence until the spring. And that's a bit more of a harsher image than we see in the previous areas that I've just mentioned. And it underscores this idea that the dying spirit of corn was embodied in its final stalks and it was carried through the barren winter months. And there is a Scottish anthropologist called Sir James Fraser, and he wrote a 12-volume work on magic, mythology and religion. And in this work, he described the old woman as the old woman of the corn is the corn spirit itself, grown aged with the waning year, yet destined to be reborn with the returning sun. And yeah, I suppose that does give it a little bit more of a darker, harsher imagery, a little bit more sad and dour, I suppose. And the complete opposite of that could be found in the Midlands, particularly in Shropshire and Warwickshire, where the last sheaf was often fashioned into what was called the Kern baby. And this figure was often dressed in scraps of cloth to resemble a child, linking that harvest to imagery of new life and continuity. And the Kern baby was kept in the farmhouse or the church until the following spring, when it was ritually destroyed or returned to the soil. And it's a massive contrast to the old woman. In fact, it's the opposite. This is a childlike form, which emphasised rebirth of the crop rather than its death. So up in the north, you're getting a bit more of a morose vibe. And then in the Midlands, it's a lot more optimistic. It's a lot more of a positive interpretation of the harvest cycle. And finally, we're going to go to Kent and the south east. So in Kent and Sussex, the tradition sometimes took the form of what was called corn poppets. And I think that's an adorable name. But these were small woven tokens rather than full effigies, and they were often exchanged as gifts or hung in stables and homes as protective charms. And it's interesting because here the emphasis is a lot less on this sort of communal ceremony. If you think back to everything that we've said about these before, a lot of it is based on community. The community gathered to cut down that last sheaf. The community gathered to put that back into the earth in the spring. Whereas here, it's a lot more on personal or household blessings rather than a communal ceremony. But regardless of where the corn dolly or the corn mother or the old mother or the corn poppet was made, the persistence of this custom well into the 19th century suggests that it's pretty deeply rooted in English folklore, even as the Industrial Revolution happened and rural life in England was very much transformed. The corn dolly remained an emblem of continuity, and it was a reminder that the harvest was never only about economics, but it was also about relationship. It's the relationship between the English people and their land and their tradition, and the unseen forces that helped sustain both. And when many modern folklorists have studied the corn dolly, they have noted that it embodies a distinctly feminine cycle: maiden, mother, and crone. When the harvest spirit is embodied into a young woman, it's the maiden. When woven into a full-bodied dolly, it's the mother. And when attached to the last withered sheaf, it's the old woman, the dying aspect of the grain spirit. And James Fraser, who I mentioned earlier, saw in this triad a reflection of ancient European fertility cults. But scholars today are a little bit more cautious about assuming a direct continuity. But nevertheless, the symbolism is pretty striking. The harvest cycle mapped onto the cycle of womanhood, where each stage is necessary and sacred. And even today, corn dollies are made by craftspeople, but they're a bit more of a heritage art than as a ritual. But the echoes of their original meaning remain really clear. The corn dolly is a relic of a worldview in which women, crops, and the continuity of life were inseparably linked, each depending on the other for survival. In this cycle, we get a little glimpse of how farmers of England understood their world. Not as mere economics, but as a living, breathing relationship between earth, spirit, and human community. When we put all of the figures that I've spoken about today side by side, Demeter and Ceres from the Mediterranean, Chicomecoatl from Mesoamerica, Zemyna from the Baltic Islands, Pachamama of the Andes, and the Corn Mother traditions of Europe, we begin to see something that I've mentioned a lot in the course of this podcast: a shared human preoccupation, this never-ending need to explain, personify, and honour the forces that make life possible. All of these figures embody the really intimate link between human survival and the fertility of the earth. Demeter mourns Persephone and withholds the grain, making a bit of a drama in the cosmic cycle of loss and renewal. Ceres sustains Rome not only with bread, but with the very laws that help to govern community life. Chicomecoatl, the seven serpent, reveals the ambivalent power of maize, life-giving, but needing a little blood sacrifice in return. Zemyna embodies the soil itself, all at once nurturing and exacting, demanding reverence in the simplest gestures of pouring milk or bread into the ground. Pachamama embraces a broader horizon, uniting earth, time, and space into a cosmos where every harvest is a sacred exchange. The corn mother or corn dolly of English and European folklore stands as a bit more of a humble but no less profound echo of these themes. in this woven figure fashioned from the last sheaf of grain, the spirit of the harvest is captured, preserved, and carried into the next year. No, she kind of lacks a bit of the complex mythologies of all of the goddesses we've spoken about. The corn dolly does embody the same intuition, which is that the grain is alive and it's got to be honoured and it's powerful, and that power has got to be kept safe across this cycle of death and rebirth. And in doing all of the research for this episode, I found it so incredibly striking that what really unites all of these traditions from all over the world, and there are other ones as well that I haven't mentioned today, but what unites them all, what's the sort of common theme of all of them, is that they all recognise that agriculture isn't just an economic activity, but it's a bit more of a sacred drama. To plant is to trust, and to harvest is to give thanks, and to not neglect the gods or the spirits of the fields, because if you do that, you're risking famine and you're risking death. And all of the figures that we've explored today, whether they were goddesses or whether they were just, little corn poppets, are different cultural expressions of that same ethos that food is never just food, it's life itself, albeit wrapped in ritual. And at the same time as all of these common themes, the differences, all of these little subtle differences, just remind us of how many diverse ways cultures can imagine this human relationship to the earth. The Greeks and Romans framed it more in terms of divine law and cosmic order. The Aztecs saw a cycle of sacrifice and renewal. The Balts emphasised reverence to the soil as a living being itself. And the Andean people placed mutual exchange at the centre of their worldview, while English farmers expressed the mystery in craft and seasonal continuity. And together, these stories reveal that the harvest is not just about crops, it's about identity and community, and the eternal human quest to find meaning in the cycles of nature. Across all of these stories, we see humanity's enduring attempt to weave the natural and the sacred into one. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Ladies of Law. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been really fun for me. I love doing these sort of more themed and seasonal episodes, but I will be back next time. Back to the normal format. We will pick one Lady of Law, and that's who we will talk about. But it's been really fun to do this. And if this is something that you are interested in, do let me know, because we've got lots of seasons. Well, we have 4 seasons, but we have lots of things that we can talk about within those seasons. And if this is something that you'd like me to do for winter, for spring, for summer, then let me know, because I will very happily do that. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please do feel free to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. If you're able to leave me a comment, please do. I read them all. They all make me very happy. And you can always leave a review as well if you like. All of the links to anything social media wise and the Patreon will be in the show notes, along with all of the sources that I've used, and hopefully some links to some pictures of all of the different corn dollies as well. Once again, thank you very much, and I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.